What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. I have a very special episode of Behind the Layers for you guys today. Not only are we going to be breaking down one of my favorite pieces I've made, and honestly one you guys ask about quite often, at the end we're going to be turning it into a book cover for a pretty popular series of books. And if you don't know which ones I'm talking about, read a book. So if you're anything like me, born in the mid to late 80s, there's a really good chance you grew up reading the Goosebumps books by R.L. Stine. They were quite popular. One of my favorite things about these books was the illustrations for the covers. Tim Jacobus did just a phenomenal job illustrating them. The cover design is so simple yet so effective. It's great. It's classic 90s. And the names are phenomenal too. The Haunted Mask, Stay Out of the Basement, Night of the Living Dummy. It's simple yet super effective. Now I know what you're thinking. Did he just change his shirt? I sure did. You're going places, kid. So if you follow me on Instagram, you know I love nostalgic things. If you don't follow me on Instagram, what are you doing with your life? But for real, I enjoy creating art that brings a sense of nostalgia to people. That's why today I'm gonna show you guys how to make a Goosebumps book cover using Blender, Daz, and Photoshop. Honestly, you can do this entire piece using just Photoshop, but why use one when you can have a menage a trois? Anyway, let me think of a cheesy line to start this. Let's turn to page 1 and start this voyage. Nailed it. So the first thing I did was start building the scene in Blender, which meant building these bookcases. I created a cube and changed up the dimensions so it had its general real-world shape and scale. I went into edit mode, added a loop cut at the top and bottom, then I inset that middle face just a bit, then extruded it back. I didn't want the top to be flat, so I added some more loop cuts and then extruded out these 3 faces. This just helped give the top some shape. I added 2 loop cuts to the bottom and pulled that face forward a bit just for some more shape. I then added a bevel modifier and that was pretty much it. For the shelves, I duplicated the bottom face, then separated it into its own object. I simply extruded the top of it up to make a shelf and then added an array modifier to repeat it all the way up. I added a wood texture, then modified it a bit to get an old grungy look, and then applied some more array modifiers until I got the layout I wanted for the scene. Okay, next, let's make the floor. Super simple. I added a plane, found a wood texture that I felt might be in an old library, applied it to the plane, then added some grunge to it to bump up that realism. Next was to get some lighting in there. I used a Studio HDRI and then a bunch of point lights and an area light to get the mood I wanted. Lastly, I added a cube and filled it with a principled volume shader node to get some haze in there. Now it was time to add all the books. So did I model all of these? Not exactly. I downloaded a bunch of stock photos of books. I took them into Blender and added them as an image plane. From here, I went into edit mode and used the knife tool to cut around the edges. I then deleted the outer faces so it was just the books. I then used the knife tool again to add cuts going down each edge of the books. I did this a bit more precisely when I actually made these. From there, I now had faces I could extract. I extracted them at different depths to give the illusion that some books were larger or smaller. I then added a bevel modifier and messed with their textures in the shading panel. I did this for like 12 different images and it was honestly kind of a pain in the ass. After that, I arranged them on all the shelves and tried to switch them up as much as possible just to hide the duplicates. I wanted our main character to be reading with a flashlight. I could have just bought a 3D model, but if it's something I can model myself, most of the time I'll try to do it myself. There's nothing wrong with buying 3D models, but there's definitely a rewarding feeling when you do it yourself. So I found a reference image for the flashlight I liked and imported it as an image plane. I then used it to guide my modeling. I inserted a cylinder, changed it to only have 12 sides as I didn't need so much geometry, and I just started following the shape. I used loop cuts to create all the ridges and the light. I simply just extruded the faces in along the normals to achieve this. I then added a subdivision surface modifier and applied shade smooth, and the shape was done. I didn't add the switch because it wasn't going to be seen, so no need to model it. I then simply added a metal texture and added some scratches to it just to make it look a bit more vintage, because scratches apparently mean vintage. So now let's jump over to Daz 3D. If you don't know Daz 3D, it's a pretty cool program where you can buy characters, outfits, poses, all kinds of cool stuff and make renders within Daz. I, however, just like to use it for my characters and then composite them into my edits. So for the main girl, I bought a character, an outfit pack for her main attire, some shoes, and a pack for her hair, and another for her glasses and earrings. The packs are fairly cheap, but they can definitely add up. However, you can do whatever you want with the renders once you have them, so that is pretty great. So as you can see, I added my character that assembled her outfit, her hair, changed her hair color, her shoes, the glasses, and even her facial expression. Daz is a bit of a weird UI, but once you get it, it's pretty easy. I then bought some poses of a person reading. I found one that kind of worked, applied it, then had to go in and modify it a bit because it wasn't how I wanted. The poses are good starting points, but I always have to modify them a lot to fit my actual concept. That is if I even start with one. I matched my camera angle from Blender and then rendered this image. I also exported an OBJ of the character to use in Blender. I didn't want to render her from Blender as materials look awful when you import from Daz to Blender, but I was able to import her and hide her from the camera and just have her shadow show in the render. This pretty much gave me my final baseplate image to use in Photoshop. I did this exact process for the ghost, except I didn't render her in Daz. I rendered her in Blender. I rendered 3 versions of her that I was going to composite together. One is glowing, another is her with 0 lights in the scene, and the last is another material specifically for Eevee. The node setups for the materials will be a bit hard to see on screen, so I'm going to put a Google Drive link in the description that'll have the material setups. So now that I have my base plate, the render of the girl, and the renders of the ghost, it was time for Photoshop. Oh yeah, I also rendered the flashlight to add to her hands in Photoshop. So the first thing I did was adjust my base plate. It was actually too bright, so I used Camera Raw to darken it a bit, then added a mask to adjust some areas to stay brighter. Next, I added the girl and placed her over her shadow, which lined up perfectly. I wanted to connect her with the ground more, so I added a gradient overlay to her just to darken the bottom portion of her. I then used the neutral channel of selective color to shift her colors to the cooler side, and then applied a curves layer to darken her and exposure layer to darken a bit more. Why did I use 2? Well, I added layer masks to these to customize them a bit. After applying the curves to generally darken her, I painted on the mask to actually bring some more light back in around her edges. I did the opposite on the exposure one. I inverted the mask, then painted in where some areas needed to be darker. Before I can add any more lighting to her, we really have to tackle this ghost, who's essentially made up of 4 images composited together. First thing I did was add the layer that was rendered with no lights. I put it in screen mode, then adjusted the black blend diff on her to about 53. This just knocked out some of those darker spots to help with the translucency. Next, I duplicated this layer, changed the blend mode to linear dodge add, and changed her blend diff to about 34, then used Camera Raw to give her a bit more texture. Next, I added in the cycles render. This one I put into the blend mode hard light and adjusted the top black blend diff to 175 and the bottom to 29. I didn't like how her face was looking, so I masked a lot of it out to let the layers below come through. Lastly, I added the Eevee bloom layer over top. I put it in screen mode and knocked the blend diff down to about 69. This was the base for her. I then went and painted away some of her on each layer to add a bit more translucency. This was looking pretty good, but she wasn't done yet. Her hair was looking pretty boring, so I went in on a few different layers and hand painted some brighter strands in. I then added a selective color adjustment layer to shift her colors more towards this aqua tone. I then added a gradient map, used these colors and put it in soft light to really give her a ghostly color. I removed some of it using the layer mask, which helped reduce the uniformity of the color and randomize it a bit. Her eyes weren't looking scary enough though, so I basically just whited them out to make her look a bit more terrifying. Lastly, I wanted to add some kind of ghostly fog emitting from her. You know, how ghosts usually have. So I took a powder brush and painted around the edges, just on certain parts of her to kind of create that effect. And with that, our library ghost is pretty much done. Let's move back over to the girl, because we still have a lot of work to do on her. Areas of her needed to be darker due to the intense light that was now coming from behind her. So I added more shadows to her jeans and shirt just by hand painting them on a new layer. When I'm thinking about how to light a character, I'm not thinking of just rim lights. We need to create some greenish fall off from the ghost. Now we don't want this over the entire character because that just isn't how light works, but we do want some of that color to spill over onto her. So I took a soft round brush, I dropped a green from the ghost, made a new layer, placed it in soft light, clipped it to the girl, and softly painted around the edges of the girl. I find that soft light mode just really helps these colors blend. Now I kept these kind of close to the edge, but again, they aren't rim lights. And I'm doing this kind of quick just so you get the gist of how I did this. But definitely use a low opacity and kind of just build this effect up. Now it's time for the rim lights. I've done these in pretty much every single video that I have up here, so I'm not gonna go through and show it in intense detail, but I do mine on a bunch of different layers because I like to use different colors, just depending on the light that's coming from behind the source. And sometimes I'll use different brushes just depending on if I'm painting on skin or painting on fabric. I'm doing this quick for the sake of time, but I really just go around and paint where I think light would catch. Same with on her face. I'm also adding specular light to her glasses, her eyes, lips, any of those little like wet areas or glass areas that would really catch light. And you also have to go in and hand paint her hair. It's time consuming and can be a pain, but it just makes that much more of a difference. All right, so getting closer. For those who don't know, this piece is actually in the Ghostbusters universe. And if you haven't seen Ghostbusters, you should probably reassess your life, just a little bit. Anyway, so I thought it'd be cool to have her reading Tobin's Spirit Guide. So I designed a book cover for Tobin's Spirit Guide. And guess where I got the font for this book cover? You guessed it, it's today's sponsor, Envato Elements. Everyone is using Envato Elements these days. Designers, content creators, influencers, podcasters, even ghosts. Yeah, that's right. They really get a kick out of those ghost sounds that they have on here. But for real, Envato has an arsenal of assets ready for you to use. If you do anything creative, I guarantee you will find a use for Envato in your toolbox. So use the link in my description to sign up. Not only does it get you access to millions of assets and unlimited downloads, it helps support this channel. Okay, let's get back to this book cover. So the book was pretty simple to do. I added in images of parts of the book and just transformed them to fit the book that she was holding. I put them in soft light and messed with the blend diff, and I also used selective color and brightness and contrast just to make sure they were seamless. I warped some page textures to fit over the ones that were there, just to make them pop a bit more and give them a bit more detail. And then painted in shadows to bring it all together. Boom, that's it, the book is done. Okay, one of the last things here was adding the flashlight render. I dropped in the image, placed it in her hand, and then added a layer mask to bring her hand over it. From there, shadows got added under it, some aqua colors got added to make it blend, and then I used a sunshine brush to add a light beam. Masked it how I needed, and topped it off with some lens flares. Let there be light. To up the realism, I painted some white on the pages to make it look more like the beam from the flashlight was hitting the pages, and added some dust particles to the beam as light usually exposes dust. I then added some new layers, set them to linear light, and just painted some light on the books in the back as I felt they would be a bit more illuminated from the ghost. I then added images of cobwebs, put them in screen mode, messed with the opacity and blur depending on how close or far they were from the camera, and then placed them over top of the books to just, up the creepy factor. Finally, it was time to color grade. I did my normal stuff, pushing the highlights a bit, messing with colors, trying out some filters. I just go until my eyes are happy, and this was the final look. But we aren't done yet. We got to make this into a Goosebumps book cover now. I'll add this template to the description for you to download, but for those of you who want to see how I remake it, keep watching. First thing I'm going to do is start with an image of a Goosebumps book cover. I want to isolate the border and top text. You could pen tool this out, but if you have Adobe Illustrator, there's a quicker method. I'm going to use selective color to make a selection of just the red areas, then create a mask of this. I'm going to make it black, then export it as a PNG. Now I'll open it in Illustrator and use the live trace feature to make it a vector. It also smooths the edges a bit. I fixed the gap in the letter B and then copied this. Now, back in Photoshop, I pasted it into my dock and made sure I went to the edges. I chose a purple color for my slime, but you can use any color you like. The border also has a light stroke to it that I added via the layer styles. I then made a box for the top part and also gave it the same stroke. The font for the bottom is Futura STD Medium Condensed. If you don't have that, Envato Elements has a ton of similar ones. The Jarl Stein text I simply made a selection of, pasted it over top the original, then put it in Multiply and used Blend If to remove the white. I then made the top box a light blue color. It needed the Scholastic logo at the bottom, so I made a red box there and put the logo into a new dock. I used Color Range to make a selection of the white, masked out the text, added a white color overlay, then placed it on the book cover in the bottom corner. Lastly, I added some grunge and worn paper textures over top, which again, you can get similar ones from Envato Elements. And here we have it, the final piece. This is by far one of my favorite pieces I've made. In my opinion, it just really captures that 90s Goosebumps look and really hits that feeling of nostalgia when I see it. Feel free to make any design you want and place it in the template we made. All right, that's the end of this episode. Thank you guys for watching this video. If you liked the video, please give it a like. Feel free to follow me on Instagram, Twitter. Please subscribe to the channel if you're not already. it would mean the world to me. If you're looking for some help in Photoshop, I have a 10-hour course that is linked in the description. I don't know why I just did that, but it's down there in that part of the video. If you guys like any of the artwork behind me, I try to make sure to swap some of them for every single video. Links for all the artists will be in the description. Go support them. They're way more talented than I am. And with that, I'll see you guys on my next voyage.